Good afternoon, and thank you everybody for being here. My name is Cindy Fierros, and I'm a recent graduate of the University of Utah, coming out of the College of Education. I want to begin today with a confession. Sorry, it's probably the recovering Catholic in me, but I find that it'll provide a little bit of context for what I'm going to present on today. And that is that I am tired, exhausted, actually. And it's not the mental exhaustion of, say, sleep deprivation, and it's not the physical exhaustion of, say, a hard day of work. My spirit is really tired. And perhaps some of you can relate. 2017 has been and continues to be a really tumultuous year. The rescinding of DACA, attacks on our immigrant communities, the refusal to acknowledge white supremacy is a problem in our community, the continued attacks on trans bodies, particularly trans bodies of color, the attacks on movements like Black Lives Matter. This is all creating, at the state, at the national, and at our local environments, really toxic spaces. And I'm just tired. Spaces of higher education are by no means free from this toxicity. In fact, spaces of higher education have historically and continue to be spaces where social hierarchies along classes of race and gender, for example, are perpetuated. But spaces of higher education, as I hope to show today, are also spaces of subversion, spaces of activism. My own activism is in the space of the higher education classroom. I'm an educator activist. In my classes, through my curriculum and through my pedagogy, through my relationships with my students, I center white supremacy, I center heteronormativity, I center patriarchy as foundational and problematic aspects of our U.S. institutions. I also center and incorporate the voices of our communities who are marginalized, our communities of color, our indigenous communities, our immigrant families, and our immigrant communities as well, for example. But this work is exhausting. And again, I'm tired. So how do I continue to do this work? Well, this is the question that really encouraged me to do the research that I did for my dissertation. I wanted to know what other faculty of color, and particularly what other Chicanx faculty in higher ed spaces were doing, not only to nurture their activism, but to nurture their very well-being. This took me on a very beautiful and hopeful journey that I'm very grateful for. I was able to identify 7 Chicanx faculty who incorporate spirituality as part of their activist work. And I want to talk to you about a couple of those today and share some of those examples of what spiritual activism looks like in the classroom. Before I do that, I want to be clear about something in terms of when I'm talking about spirituality. Not in a way to define spirituality, but in a way to give you a little bit of a roadmap of what it means and doesn't mean in my work. I'm talking about a secular spirituality, a spirituality that is not necessarily tied to any one dogma or religion. I'm very much influenced by the work of Chicana scholar Teresa Delgadillo, who talks about spirituality in terms of the identification of a sacred, again, not necessarily connected to any one religion or dogma. Spirituality is an understanding of the intimate ways that we are related. Spirituality as a way of understanding that it's how we are in the world, how we know the world. And spirituality is a way of knowing the world, an epistemology. That is what guided my own research inquiry. So what does it look like? What does spiritual activism, or what Ana Louise Keaton defines spirituality for social change, what does that actually look like? And what can it look like in spaces of higher education, where we're supposed to be very secular, right? Very separate in terms of the intellectual and the spiritual. I won't have time to talk about all 7 contributors, but I do want to honor them now because they are pivotal in my continual pedagogical and spiritual growth. So thank you to Drs. Elenas, Dr. Medina, Dr. Lara, Dr. Luna, Dr. Calvo, Dr. Pacheco, and Dr. Figueroa, who are all in California minus one, who's in Arizona. So what does it look like? Well, it varies. Dr. Pacheco is a professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies, which is right in downtown San Francisco. You walk into this building after coming out of the chaotic parking search into this very calm, kind of quiet building. Her work is around curanderismo, or the traditional healing methods of indigenous communities. You can find her in the community. She's got this really cool vintage trailer that she hitches to her car, and her colleague attend various community events, and they offer limpias or cleanses and herbal remedies to the community. But this is also in her classroom, and this looks very different depending on her class. In a gender studies class, she invites her students to create an altar, an altar, where they identify one aspect of their identity and search for various objects that can speak to that identity. She then invites her students to sit with this altar and reflect on the objects that they chose. This can be painful because sometimes our identities are imposed identities, sometimes our identities are limited identities, and sometimes our identities are struggles against stereotypes that others have of us. But it can also be very cathartic for students as well, because it enables to recognize the power that they hold in creating their own identity. Sometimes Dr. Pacheco starts her classes by asking students to meditate. Sometimes they do some yoga. Sometimes she starts with the burning of incense and reflection. In another class, she might ask students to bring an object from home for the creation of a class altar that they will be reflecting on throughout the entire class. There are two really important parts of these examples coming out from Dr. Pacheco's work. One is an incorporation of epistemologies that have been deemed inferior, right? And ancestral knowledges that are usually not identified as legitimate and valid ways of knowing. Another part is a healing part. Curanderismo comes from the word curar, to heal. And it's a recognition that students enter our classroom not devoid or not separate or not unable to just remove whatever it is that was happening outside of the classroom. And sometimes those experiences are traumatic, whether they are personal traumas, familial traumas, or communal traumas, historical traumas of dealing with discrimination. And that is very much an important part of Dr. Pacheco's work, allowing her students the space to heal. Another example comes from Dr. Luz Calvo, a professor at Cal State East Bay in Hayward, California. Dr. Calvo's work, very excitingly, is around food, okay? And yes, eating and nurturing the food, but also the meaning that we place on food. Dr. Calvo's work comes after and is really informed by a very scary diagnosis and treatment of cancer, which led Dr. Calvo to conduct research on cancer in Latino communities, research which identified the Latino immigrant paradox for them, which states that immigrant Latinos arrive to the U.S. actually healthier than their either U.S.-born counterparts or their comrades who have been here for some time. A result of that being the standard American diet, appropriately acronymed SAD. So Dr. Calvo wanted to counter this, wanted to return back to a healthy way of eating and being. So with their partner and the help of some university students, Dr. Calvo and this group created a garden in their very backyard. And eventually conversations began with students about healthier ways of eating. And one student asked for a simple recipe. Can you tell me how to make a pot of beans? And from that one simple interaction, there is now a Facebook page that is a really huge social media phenomenon with hundreds of followers and a cookbook. And there's certainly recipes in the cookbook, but there is also context in the cookbook. Context about the way that colonization disrupts food sources, the way colonization disrupts relationships to the land and to health and to our bodies. So there's two aspects of Dr. Calvo's work. One is the aspect of reclaiming, these ancestral knowledges, reclaiming our ways of being, reclaiming health. But Dr. Calvo also recognizes this as a very spiritual project. In fact, they very beautifully talk about the ways that they were able to heal spiritually by digging their hands in the dirt and working in the garden. Because there was one aspect of the cancer and the treatment, right? There was the physical ailment and healing from the physical aspect of it. But there was also, as Dr. Calvo says, a susto, a shock of this very frightening diagnosis. And so working in the garden was a very spiritual way of healing, and something that Dr. Calvo wants for their students as well. Another example comes from San Diego, from Dr. Irene Lara, who is a professor at San Diego State University. Her work is with undergrads and is very much informed by her own undergrad experience at Stanford, an Ivy League institution that she felt was very traumatic. She felt during her undergrad that she very much had to negate her spirituality in order to develop as an intellectual. But because her spirituality was so tied up with her epistemology, her way of knowing the world as a Chicana feminist, she really struggled with this. So what she wanted was, as she said, a way for it to not hurt so much. So this led to a dissertation on decolonizing Latina sexualities and spiritualities. And now that very much informs her work with undergrads. At San Diego State, they have a really good program, which I know they have at other universities, that offers undergrads the opportunity to conduct research, to work with the faculty mentor. Dr. Lara calls hers curandera scholar activists. So one part of this group is that they are conducting very critical, intense research, talking about theory, talking about research methodologies and methods. But it is also an approach, Dr. Lara calls it femturing, a feminist mentoring, an understanding that, again, these are students who are holistic beings, who come to the classroom with various experiences, both personal and familial, and who, in order to thrive as intellectual students, need to have their holistic beings attuned to and nurtured for and cared for. These are all just some of the very beautiful examples and things that I got to learn about. But I think that they offer us a lot of hope for ways that we can do activism differently. In one way, thinking about the interconnectedness of our spirituality, of the very intimate ways that we are connected to each other. Sometimes that connection requires us to look at systems of discrimination that connect us and how we may challenge those. But also looking at the ways that this work can be exhausting, right? That this work requires sometimes acknowledging a lot of trauma, acknowledging a lot of discomfort, and the truth that in order to move from that, we have to heal and we have to engage. So today I want to encourage us all, challenge us all, whether we are educators, whether we identify as activists, whether we identify as spiritual or not. I want us to think about the ways that we may be intimately connected to our neighbor, even if that means acknowledging a form of privilege that discriminates our neighbor, that oppresses our neighbor. And I want us to think about the ways that our very existence, our very being, may be in a way traumatic for somebody else, right? Because of those systems of discrimination that connect us. And I want us also to think about the ways that we may begin to be spiritual beings, not just in our personal lives, but in our professional lives and in our communal lives as well. That's what these wonderful educators did for me. I was nervous to talk about this. I can't bring a religion in a critical space or spirituality in a critical space. And I say religion because, as I mentioned, recovering Catholic, thinking that spirituality had to be connected to that. Understanding that I can still be a spiritual being without necessarily having to be connected to religion, right? They've encouraged me to say that is a part that is okay, that is a part that I can include in the classroom, and that is a part that I need to acknowledge from other students. So today I want to encourage, perhaps challenge you, to think about the ways that you can maybe nurture your spiritual well-being in a way to understand how you might be connected to your neighbor who may also be a spiritual well-being. Thank you.